going to continue today our November series. So we started our November series last week about remembering and releasing. And the idea is really about remembering the deepest truth of life and how we have to release any obstacles that are preventing us from experiencing God's infinite presence. So last week, we really explored this idea of remembering and releasing with Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. And we did our ritual, and we talked about the idea of being able to release old stories in our lives, in our family, in our lineages, that ancestral clearing to be able to create new stories. Now this week, we're going to kind of add to this idea of remembering and releasing by adding to it the idea of restoring. You'll come to find out I love alliteration, RRR. So remember, release, and restore is today. Now, restoration is really about this idea of balance. It's about this idea of coming back to an original or natural state. So we're going to play with that idea today as we move forward. Much of life and life's issues and problems are really, or where we experience them as problems, are the result of an imbalance. If we think about the things that happen in our bodies, disease, it's an imbalance. If we think about conflict in our relationships and in our families or whatever, friendships, there's an imbalance there oftentimes. If we really kind of go to the core of what's happening, it's an imbalance. And so we think today about how we open up a space to recognize where things are imbalanced in our lives and move forward to be able to create that balance. I really started thinking a lot about this last week because after service we had some indigenous ceremonial dancers. Did any of you all see them last week? Yeah, they were incredible. And what is really special about them, they're called Il Hui Camina Flechador del Sol, and they're here in Nashville. They're based here in Nashville. When I saw them a number of weeks ago, actually over a month ago, it was at a powwow here in town. And we wanted to see them, and my wife and I, Veronica, wanted to see them. And they started dancing, and I thought to myself, is this dance ever gonna end? And if you were there last week, you experienced that. And that was kind of like the ego mind, the mortal mind, like didn't really understand what was happening. And so I really took that to heart, like what was that about, my relationship to feeling that way? And I realized that they take dance seriously. They are not dancing as ego. They are not dancing for show. They are not dancing to entertain. They are dancing to restore balance. And the way that they spoke, they got a chance to talk a little bit about what they were doing, and they talked about this idea of their dancing is part of an indigenous ceremony and process that helps to restore balance in the universe. And they encouraged us to think about ways that we could restore balance in our lives by restoring this idea of the balance of the divine masculine and feminine. Talked a lot about that, about how the divine masculine and feminine need to have a union and energetically again. They talked about the ways in which we don't value our environment, we don't value the land, and we don't value nature, and how we need to restore that as part of our own human way of being in the world. Balance. And so every movement that they made, every sound that they uttered in song, every drum beat was purposeful. And something happened. Those of us who stayed, I think, were really blown away because there was about 10 of us that stayed afterwards till the end. And like I said, it was definitely a long ceremony, but it was a ceremony for them. And I was really shocked at all of the emotion that came out after that dance. It was really powerful and unexpected. And I was surprised that the dancers themselves shared really authentically and deeply about what was coming up for them as a process, in that process of dance. So many of us, there were tears flowing, there was movement, there was a balance that was struck. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of balance. And even thinking about that, I remembered we watched the movie Coco last week. And again, it's all of these things that remind us about balance in the world. If we think about Coco's journey, the Disney movie Coco, he was also on a journey of balance. He was attempting to find balance between himself and his family. He was attempting to find balance between this idea that he had a passion for music, but also was there also this egoistic passion that was self-serving for his music. He wanted to be famous. He had an idea of wanting to also strike a balance between the past and the present. If we look at what happened in that movie, he stole the guitar. Does anybody remember that? He stole the guitar, and then he gets transported to the land of the dead. And then he needs a blessing from his ancestor to come back to the living. He needed a blessing. The funny thing that happens in the beginning, he's looking for the blessing from who he thought was his grandfather, who ended up being the epitome of selfishness, self-serving ego, right? Now, had he gotten the blessing from that person who he thought was his grandfather, there may have been a different evolution of the story. But he has to go through all this hero's journey, right? To be able to understand that what he thought was real wasn't, what he valued wasn't as important, and what he took for granted, like his family, like the ceremony of the Day of the Dead, was something that he needed to rebalance within himself. All of these things happen in this beautiful way where he's finally then getting his blessing from his ancestors, but he got the blessing willing to be able to surrender his ego and to surrender what he thought was real and true. And it's so bizarre because when you think about what he went through, it's a very universal thing that all of us go through. Those of you who may remember, there's a very famous story in the Bible that is very much like this. It's the story of Jacob. Does anybody know that story? The story of Jacob. I'm going to just give you a little bit of a primer about that because we're going to go into Jacob today because I think it's a really great lesson for us as we think about this idea of balance and blessing. So Jacob was the son, okay? He was the son of Isaac and Rebekah. And he was the grandson also of Abraham, prophet Abraham, who God promised to make a father of many nations. And he had a twin brother named Esau. And Esau was the firstborn. And as the story goes, Jacob grabbed his brother on the heel during birth. And the name Jacob actually means supplanter or to grab another's heel. But in this story, and literally speaking, it comes to mean to take what belongs to someone else. As the story goes, he tricked his brother out of his birthright. So as the first son, even though he was a twin, he was the first one out. He was the first son. And in ancient times, there was a very big deal to be the first son and also have your father's blessing. So what he ended up doing was tricking his brother out of that blessing, and he had his mother's consent, who wanted him to be the first son. He had his mother who helped him do also to then trick his father into giving him the blessing. Now, when Esau found that he had done that, a blessing was a big deal. Not only are you getting energetically the blessing, you're also getting what comes with that. That is the material things, the prosperity, all that the family owned. So when that happened, Esau, his brother, threatened to kill him. Naturally so. He tricked him and his father into taking this blessing. And so out of fear, Jacob ends up fleeing his home. Now, many things happened in between then and now. We're not going to get into that, which are interesting in their own right. But what ends up happening is he ends up having an amazing life. He has many wives. He has much land. He has much prosperity, property. Life is going great for him overall. But something about all of that still leaves him alone, leaves him wanting, leaves him needing, leaves him wanting something more. And so God sends him a message and says, you need to go home. So he heeds to this message, but at the same time he remembers, oh shoot, my brother might kill me. He's thinking, I'm in fear of my life, but I know this is what I'm called to do. So he makes this journey. He starts to make this journey to be able to go back to his home, go back to his land. And here's where we're going to enter into the story that's important for us. On his way, he finds out that his brother's coming with 400 men. So he's thinking, it's curtains for me. That's it. But this is the journey I'm on. I'm going to just do this. And so he sends all of his people that are coming to greet the brother and coming back, making this exodus back to the land. He tells them to sort of go off on their own, and he stays alone to pray. And here's where we enter the story at Genesis chapter 32, verse 24 to 29. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, well, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is in on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. So a lot's going on there. Let's start taking that story apart. First of all, when we look at this metaphysically, now unity looks at the Bible metaphysically. What does that mean? That means to look at the Bible beyond the words, to look at what is more there than what is physically we think we're reading, to look at the mysticism, to look at what's there in the message. And so when we look at some of the meanings of the words, the idea of the story becomes elucidated. We start to see more. Esau, the name stands for the material body, the material or the body. Whereas Jacob is a representation of the intellectual or the mind. We see that those two things as representation, those brothers as the body and the material and the mind and the intellect are out of balance. Part of the journey of this story is to restore that balance together, restore what we have here that we've been given as the temple of God, to be able to then truly experience God and move and feel that presence. The balance then is that spiritual awareness. It is that Christ consciousness that we achieve when we start playing with this idea of achieving balance. But it's funny, when we start the story, it says he's alone. Well, then who is he wrestling with if he's alone? Many people have thought, well, he was wrestling with God, or he was wrestling with an angel. But in reality, if we look at this metaphysically, who was he really wrestling with? Himself. Yes, everybody gets A's here. He was wrestling with himself. That's who he was wrestling with. He was wrestling with all of his past. He was wrestling with his unresolved woundedness. He was wrestling with his guilt. He was wrestling with all of these things that he was coming to this place with. And that's where he was doing. If we look at what the word Peniel and even that was a name of the person that answered him. He said, when he asked him, what's the name? And the guy said, what do you want to know my name for? It's almost like he's saying, you don't need to know my name. You know me. You are me. This is me. I am you. But he says Penuel, and then the place becomes Penuel. Both mean face of God. So in that struggle, he is learning and seeing and being the face of God. But we've all been there. Who's been there struggling with yourself? We have, yes. We have all been there. We've all been there where we're struggling with ourselves. We think that there's this specter outside of us, this force, this thing, this person, this job, this relationship, but it's really us that we're struggling with. So part of the story here, part of the wisdom here, is to get us to understand that we are struggling with ourselves. We're acknowledging that we have a weak spot or many weak spots. And by recognizing this, we recognize our own Jacob's wound, right? It's the beginning of all healing as we become aware of this woundedness. And we are sensitive to that fact that our mindless immersion in material existence can touch that nerve. We're focused on the outside world. We're not really focused on that struggle that needs to take place oftentimes. If we imagine the story this way, Jacob experiences quite literally a dark night of the soul. He's facing his own shadow. Anybody familiar with the concept of shadow work, right? So he's facing his own shadow here. And rather than using the deception, because he was a deceiver. His name literally was about that. Instead of using the deception he had before, he's doing this honestly. He's like, okay, this is what I'm headed into. This is what I have to do now. I'm going to do this honestly, transparently, openly. And so we can imagine that in this solitary moment that he's wrestling with his life of deception, as I've said, the guilt that's racking him, deceiving his brother, all of this is happening. This shadow side of his character that we all have. And what do you do when this aspects of your character arises? Most of us do what? We hide it. It's not here. Forget this sucker. Let me push that back. Get to the back, right? No. We don't really want to acknowledge that it's here. The side that destroys and leads us away from God, our God presence, and from others. And we may try to deny it. We may try to hide it. But here's what happens. It will also come back. It will come to wrestle with you, and it will come to bite you in the hip. It will. Who has tried to deny some of this woundedness? And it will persist. It will come out. It will wrestle with you. Like Jacob, we're going through this alone sometimes. And in those quiet moments, the last minute before you fall asleep, or when you have a quiet minute in the car, doesn't it creep up? Sometimes it creeps up. But it's all good. This is the beauty of being in this community. This is the beauty of wanting to seek this awareness, to seek this connection with spirit, to seek this energetic presence that we have within us, is that we can do this together, that we can practice at this, because it's not a one and done thing. We have a culture that's like, one and done. Fast food, go big, go home. But all of this is done steadily, peacefully, progressively, and together. So I want to take this into meditation for a little bit. I'm going to do some meditation in the middle today and have us just go through this a little bit as we kind of take all of this, all of we have been talking about right now. This idea of balance, this idea of blessing, this idea of the shadow, this idea of being able to acknowledge that woundedness, to heal that woundedness, to move forward. So I'm going to invite our musicians back up here so we can start this time of meditation. So I invite you all to just close your eyes. If you've never closed your eyes before meditation, how about you wrestle with that today? open yourselves up to just closing that outer eye and opening up that inner eye. And take some beautiful, deep cleansing breaths. Just breathing in the beauty of this day, breathing in the beauty of this community, breathing in all that we are, all that we have, all that we give, and all that we receive. Just breathing all of that in and letting go, releasing what no longer serves us. Setting the intention that your breath will guide you, that your breath will lead you, that your breath will comfort you and move you into this new expression of release, of restoration, of balance. The breath is in and of itself balance. We breathe in and we breathe out. We oxygenate and we let go. So we breathe. And as we breathe, I invite you all to just consider where you need balance in your life. How might your life currently be out of balance? Could it be in your home surroundings? Could it be in your relationships, perhaps your romantic relationship or your familial relationship with children? Is there an imbalance there that needs healing? How about work? Is there an imbalance in your career, in your job, what you do in the world? Is there an imbalance with this concept of play and joy? Maybe you don't have enough of that in your life. There's a skewing. Play is so important. Things like music and dancing and nature, things like laughter. Is there balance in your life around those things? Where in your life do you need restoration? Where in your life do you need balance? Allow the Spirit to speak to you and through you right now, to give you that information and to give you, with you, as you, healing. And we rest in the silence for a few minutes, allowing for that truth, that knowing, and that healing to unfold. Today, you each are being asked, what is your name? Your name is not Mary or John or Liz. What is your name? What is your name and nature? As Jacob transitions his name to Israel, which means Prince of God, we transition today to claim our true name and nature. What is your new identity that you choose today on this new journey with God? Who are you? What is your name? We give thanks today as we allow for that beauty within to bless us, to guide us, and to show us, feel into us who we are. And we say thank you, and we say amen. You can open your eyes and come back. Today we are restoring balance. We're making the commitment here together to seeing and to being God, to allow for that intuition within us, not the expectations of the world, not the should-haves, not the could-haves, not that I need to's. It's what rises up from within that divine presence within us to tell us how we are, who we are, and what is our name. And just like in the story of Coco, it's about seeing the goodness and the godness in everyone, which is also about forgiving and facing and embracing our fears. I want to invite everyone today to kind of just do a little mental twist. In the story with Jacob, we talked about the idea that he was wrestling with God. But I started this out by talking about dancers. So what if we could, in our mind's eye and in the way we perceive all of these challenges, go from fighting or wrestling to this idea of dancing with God? Let's think about that for a second. How does that change when we think about, I am dancing with God? I'm dancing into being and becoming. I'm dancing into this mind and body integration. As I told you, the dancer said every step becomes part of the journey. Every forward, every backward. Who's a salsa dancer here? When you move forward or you move backwards, there's different steps. There's a give and a take. There's a time where I'm excelling. There's a time when I'm retreating. But all of that is part of that sacred dance, that sacred journey that we do to be able to understand, to feel, and to be the blessing. We each give ourselves the blessing. Yes, we bless each other, but ultimately the blessing that we need, as Jacob sees, is the blessing we give ourselves, the compassion we give ourselves, the understanding that we give ourselves, the forgiveness that we give ourselves. So we're dancing today with God. Like the dancers, we're engaging in this rhythm with the Spirit. Every step counts, not for just me, not for just you, but for the fate of the world. These dancers believe that can you imagine, in this little tiny space here on the property of Unity of Nashville, they left with their heart full, knowing that they had led to restoration here and that the dance that they did was blessing the world and was creating restoration out there. Can you imagine the faith that that takes? But we all have that as we engage in our own dance. And we remember that when we're dancing with God, when we're going through this process, when we're going through this shadow side, when we're going through this dark night of the soul, we all are engaging in a process that is not just important to ourselves, but important to be able to shine into the world a new love and a new light. We create a new blessing with every step, with every new story, with every new dance, with every new blessing. We come back to balance, we come back to oneness, we come back to truth in the dance. Truth. And here's the truth. We are doing amazing things, and we are doing amazing things in the world. And so it is.